So we've spent our entire course of study on the Cold War talking about those countries that were either in the Soviet sphere or in the American sphere, or a country like China that we thought was in the Soviet sphere but ended up creating its own sphere. Well, what happens if you are in neither the Soviet sphere or in the American sphere? This is what is known as the non-aligned movement. You are not officially aligned with either Cold War superpower, the United States or the Soviet Union. So these are those nations that would reject any official alliance with either superpower. India and China are going to be the most important nations that were members of this non-aligned movement. But also Egypt, we need to talk about briefly as well. And their leader, a guy named Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser from Egypt. It's going to be another important figure in the non-aligned movement. So the non-aligned movement, you guys ever heard the phrases first world, second world, third world? Usually we hear of them in respect to like third world nations being impoverished nations, first world nations being the wealthy industrialized nations of the world, second world nations kind of in between. The actual origins of the first world, second world, third world come in the discussions of the Cold War. The first world nations were those nations that were aligned with the United States. They tended to be advanced industrialized nations. Second world nations were those nations that were aligned with the Soviet Union. They were also industrialized. They tended to be industrialized. Many of them, though, not as far along as the Western industrialized powers. The third world nations were those nations, many of them very new to the global scene. For example, most of Africa. Most of Africa, these were countries that were colonies before World War II and through much of the 1950s, but only recently became independent states. Many of these third world nations are what are going to occupy what we call the non-aligned movement. Many of these countries are nations that recently threw out their colonial oppressors. So much of Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, they pushed out their colonial oppressors. And so they saw like aligning with the United States or even aligning with the Soviet Union as just a continuation of imperialism. And we can see that they wouldn't want that. They wanted independence. They wanted to make their own way. So they didn't want to ally with the United States or the Soviets for fear that that would create the same imperialist conditions that they used to live under. In many cases, these nations tended to be anti-American, and in some cases also anti-Soviet, as they saw Americans in the Soviet Union, but more so Americans, trying to throw around military or financial pressures in order to exert their will on these nations. Yes, Kevin?
What's the difference between the light and dark blue colored countries?
I think this map was just plucked out of Wikipedia, and it just when nations left the non-aligned movement, or joined or ultimately left the non-aligned movement. I can look that up at the end. The aims of the non-aligned movement was that they would ultimately have no defensive pacts or alliance with the United States or the Soviet Union. But that doesn't mean these countries had no relationship with the United States or the Soviet Union. In fact, some like Nasser in Egypt would attempt to play both the Soviets and the Americans against each other. I kind of think of like that maybe that child of modern divorce who might play both his mom and his dad against each other in order to get more loot at Christmas time or birthdays or something. I'm like, Mom wouldn't get that for me. Daddy's going to hook you up. Don't worry about it. And so the non-aligned movement in nations like Egypt would try to get benefits, military assistance, for example, from both the Soviets or possibly financial assistance from the Americans, without ever officially joining either side's sphere of influence. As more and more countries would become independent, where this story becomes kind of important, and this is we'll also harken back to this when we talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict. Where this story becomes a little bit more important is as Africa, for example, or Southeast Asia is decolonized and these become independent nations. The number of countries in the world, like represented in the United Nations, is going to dramatically increase. And the relative strength around the planet of the United States or the Soviet Union is going to weaken. Because there's going to be many more countries, for example, in the United Nations. Many more countries that aren't on Team USA or Team Soviet Union. And these non-aligned movements, they will essentially attempt to join each other. Hey, we are weak as individual nations, or even populous nations like India or China. We are weak as individual nations. But if we join together as a voting bloc in the United Nations, we can actually be much stronger than we are as individual nations. We could challenge the dominance of the United States or challenge the dominance of the Soviet Union. That was the intention of the non-aligned movement. It's like a union for countries that aren't a part of the Soviet sphere or countries that aren't a part of the American sphere. And this will represent a shift in the United Nations away from the United States, who had long been dominant within the United Nations power structure. However, if we look at this map, we see all kinds of different countries that are a part of the non-aligned movement. And we can easily imagine that not all of these countries would always see eye to eye with each other on various issues. For example, India and China were each members of the non-aligned movement. Did they always see eye to eye with each other? No, and those are like the two most populous non-aligned nations. At what point do India and China certainly not see eye to eye with each other? They went to war with each other in 1962, the Sino-Indian War. So just because they're not aligned and they tried to form this like organization known as the non-aligned, kind of ironic, right? We're going to create an organization called the non-aligned movement because we're not being aligned to organize. No, well, they're being aligned in some attempts with each other, right? But this movement was never in lockstep with each other. Despite the fact that the majority of the world's people are living in non-aligned nations, the non-aligned movement would never become a strong voting bloc because each one of those individual countries, they have at their hearts their own self-interests. And sometimes those self-interests lean towards the Americans. Sometimes those self-interests might lead towards the Soviets or separately towards the Chinese. Eventually, the end of the Cold War leads the non-aligned movement to really have no point anymore. It will exist for a short time after the Cold War, but it's not an important entity going forward. The collapse of the Soviet Union made the non-aligned movement basically a pointless organization. Okay, questions, comments?